Hello, everyone. I'm the parlor detective. The sun dipped low over St. Mary's, spilling a warm, golden light that made the village appear even more idyllic than usual. It was a scene worthy of a postcard, with winding cobblestone lanes, quaint thatched cottages, and the gentle hum of a community in full summer bloom. The air carried the sweet perfume of flowers, while birds offered a cheerful serenade to the guests gathered at Mrs. Bertram's annual garden party. Mrs. Bertram, a sharp-eyed widow in her mid-60s, was among the last steadfast pillars of the local aristocracy. She had lived in St. Mary's longer than anyone could recall, and over the years had become a kind of figurehead for the village. Her yearly garden party was always a grand affair, drawing together not only the upper crust but also shopkeepers, farmers, teachers, and labourers, a curious mingling of class and character. The garden itself was Mrs. Bertram's crowning pride. Manicured flower beds spread before the house, their rows of roses in full bloom sending their fragrance drifting lazily on the air. Meticulously sculpted hedges framed the grounds like living walls, and a stone path lined with lavender led directly to the great wooden doors of her home. The tables, set with delicate china, were surrounded by villagers chatting as they nibbled cucumber sandwiches and sipped tea from porcelain cups. From the far corner, a string quartet played soft, lilting melodies that floated over the crowd like a warm breeze. Children darted in and out of the hedge maze nearby, their peals of laughter punctuating the otherwise tranquil scene. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in the shade of an ancient oak at the far end of the garden, her watchful eyes moving steadily across the crowd. She wore a modest lavender dress with a matching hat, but beneath the gentle exterior lay a mind as keen as a blade, always observing, always piecing together small truths. At 75, Miss Marple had seen enough of life to read its subtleties and notice the minute details others overlooked. She was the village's silent sentinel, the one who saw what others missed. She watched the guests mingle, trading polite greetings and idle gossip. Her gaze settled briefly on a cluster of young wives, giggling behind their fans as they whispered about the latest scandal involving a local farmer. Across the lawn, she noted a group of elderly men locked in conversation about last week's cricket match, their voices tinged with equal parts pride and playful rivalry. Not far away, Dr. Gerald Parsons, the village physician, was speaking with Miss Parsons, the school teacher. Miss Marple had long noted the doctor's slight unease whenever his wife was absent. The teacher was a woman of polished manners but carried a quiet tension in her bearing. There was something unspoken between the doctor and his wife, and Miss Marple suspected the schoolteacher might not be the only one guarding a secret. Her eyes shifted to a solitary figure near the garden wall, Douglas Fillmore, the new solicitor in town. Miss Marple had met him only recently, yet despite his cultivated charm and measured words, she had already marked him as a man who kept his emotions firmly in check. He never seemed to fall into the easy rhythm of village life. She had observed him before, always slightly apart, a participant only in form. His icy blue eyes scanned the gathering without real interest, as though he were a stranger looking in on a world that did not belong to him. "Isn't it a lovely day?" a voice chimed beside her, breaking her train of thought. Miss Marple turned to see Mrs. Clara Wren, the vicar's wife, standing with a welcoming smile. Clara was a cheerful soul, ever eager for conversation and partial to a bit of gossip. Her round face was warm with the sun, the brim of her hat shading her bright eyes. "Quite lovely," Miss Marple replied softly. "Though I do wonder, Clara, if everything is as peaceful as it appears." Clara's brows lifted. "Whatever do you mean?" "It's the perfect afternoon." Miss Marple's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "There are always things beneath the surface, my dear. People rarely show what they truly feel." Clara chuckled, shaking her head. "You have a way of making everything sound so mysterious, Jane." Miss Marple offered no direct answer, her gaze once more sweeping over the crowd. She knew well that in a place like St. Mary's, nothing was ever quite as simple as it seemed. Everyone had a past, and every past carried secrets, some more dangerous than others. The quiet of the afternoon was abruptly pierced by a sharp cry from across the garden. Mrs. Bertram stood frozen by the great wooden door of her house, her hand clamped to her mouth in shock. Guests turned as one to follow her gaze. There, sprawled motionless on the stone path, lay Miss Parsons, the schoolteacher. Her face was pale, turned to one side, eyes wide in frozen terror. A dark pool of blood spread beneath her head, staining the pale stone. The sight was jarring, an ugly rupture in what had been a perfectly serene scene moments before. Chaos erupted instantly. Some screamed, others rushed forward, while a few stood rooted in stunned disbelief. Mrs. Bertram's voice rang out, raw with panic. Someone, please, help her. Miss Marple remained seated, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. She noted the villagers' reactions, their subtle differences. Mrs. Bertram was distraught, as one might expect. Clara Wren clutched her chest, looking faint. Dr. Parsons moved swiftly to the body, his professional instincts taking over, though his expression was as stricken as the rest. And there was Douglas Fillmore, rigid against the garden wall, his expression unreadable, but his stillness just a shade too deliberate for Miss Marple's liking. By the time the village constable arrived with several others from the local police, the garden party had become an impromptu crime scene. The guests were ushered into, groups were separated, their accounts recorded, their movements tracked. But Miss Marple did not immediately join the fray. Instead, she stayed seated on her bench, quietly watching and listening. She knew the first phase of any investigation was full of noise and confusion, but soon enough, the cracks in the surface would appear. In her experience, the truth had a habit of surfacing in the most unexpected places. And the truth behind this murder, she was certain, lay not in the blood on the stones, but in the people around her. The afternoon dragged on, yet Miss Marple's mind stayed sharp. Every reaction, every glance, every shift of posture, there was something valuable to be gleaned from these first moments. She could already sense that this was no ordinary crime. The locked door to Mrs. Bertram's study, where Miss Parsons had so often been seen, concealed a clue. A detail small enough to escape most eyes, yet one that could change everything. Clara, Miss Marple murmured softly, almost to herself, I believe we've just witnessed the start of something far bigger than we could imagine. The vicar's wife, still dazed, gave a vague nod, her thoughts too clouded to grasp the weight of the remark. But Miss Marple was already setting out her next steps, measured, deliberate, and just a hint sly. She had seen enough to know that the truth would reveal itself. And when it did, it would be a revelation none of them were prepared for. The hours after Miss Parsons's death blurred into a rush of activity, confusion, and growing unease. The quiet, untroubled life of St. Mary's had been wrenched into an unfamiliar and unsettling reality. Officer Cooley, a somewhat flustered man, took charge of the scene, shepherding the guests indoors, away from curious eyes, to be questioned one by one. Miss Marple, who had remained an unobtrusive figure on the edge of the gathering, now occupied the back corner of Mrs. Bertram's drawing-room. She sipped from a delicate teacup, observing the proceedings with her usual calm attentiveness. The other guests, though striving to keep their composure, were plainly rattled. Mrs. Bertram had withdrawn to a corner, hands clasped tightly, her face pale and drawn. Her usual commanding grace was replaced by a faint tremor, though she still managed polite small talk and the occasional fond reference to Miss Parsons's character. Clara Wren moved about the room, offering words of comfort to the most shaken guests. Normally brisk and bustling, she now drifted from person to person with a softer tone, her manner gentle. From time to time, she glanced at Miss Marple with a silent hope for answers. But Miss Marple was in no rush. She neither ignored the tense stillness in the room nor the air of suppressed panic, but she preferred to let others speak first, revealing themselves through their own words and mannerisms. Patience, she knew, often uncovered far more than hurried guesses. Meanwhile, Officer Cooley, clearly unprepared for a murder case, focused on asking villagers about their whereabouts rather than pressing into the real circumstances of Miss Parsons's death. His rapid questions seemed more concerned with social ties than hard facts. His usual duties revolved around lost livestock and the occasional prank by local children, not murder. "Where were you when it happened, Mrs. Bertram?" he asked, voice taut, scribbling in his notepad as though it were a lifeline. Mrs. Bertram shifted in her seat. "I was right here, overseeing the guests and the food. I was only a few feet away from the scene," she replied, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain composed. I never imagined such a thing could happen here." From her corner, Miss Marple noted how swiftly Mrs. Bertram slipped into the role of the wronged hostess. It wasn't unusual for those in authority to project control during a crisis, but the hint of helplessness felt just a shade rehearsed. Her gaze moved to the far side of the room, where Douglas Fillmore stood with his hands clasped behind his back, posture rigid. Since the body's discovery, he had not spoken a word. His silence seemed less like shock and more like calculated thought. His eyes, once cold and detached, now narrowed slightly as they studied each face in the room. There was no grief in his expression, no visible confusion. Only the calm appraisal of a man treating the crime as a puzzle, one he might already be solving. Miss Marple lingered on him a moment longer, noting the slight tilt of his chin and the subtle set of his jaw. She could see why some villagers had already placed him under suspicion, but she wasn't ready to do the same.
Not yet. Dr. Parsons, you were among the first to reach the body. What did you find?
Officer Quilly asked, turning to the physician, who had been pacing restlessly by the window. The doctor's normally steady demeanor was fraying under the weight of the moment.
I
didn't find much, he stammered. Her pulse was gone, of course, but there were no other injuries, no signs of a struggle.
I could only confirm she was dead.
Miss Marple's attention sharpened. No wounds, no struggle. The blood around her head, the way she had collapsed, something about it did not add up.
Dr. Parsons's voice grew more strained. I can't understand it, Jane. She was perfectly healthy. I saw her only yesterday. Miss Marple's brow creased at his words.
There was an edge to Dr. Parsons's voice. There was a trace of guilt that was hard to ignore.
Perhaps he had been too close to Miss Parsons. Perhaps something in their connection warranted a closer look.
But for now, Miss Marple chose not to press. At least, not yet. As the investigation moved forward, guests were gradually ushered from the room for further questioning. The shaken group began to disperse in murmurs, casting furtive glances at one another. The low hum of whispers filled the air as villagers tried to make sense of the tragedy in their midst.
Miss Marple watched with quiet detachment.
It was always like this in St. Mary's when something went awry, rumors sprouting, opinions clashing, and the inevitable rush to find someone to blame. But there was one thing she knew that others often forgot. Nothing was ever exactly as it appeared in a village like this. Everyone wore a mask, whether they realized it or not. Seated with her tea, she let the guest's words wash over her, feeling the weight of the mystery settle in. There were no obvious suspects, no glaring signs pointing to the killer. The body, the suspects, the fractured reactions, these were all pieces in the game.
And soon, someone would let something slip.
When that happened, Miss Marple would be ready. She took another sip, a faint smile touching her lips. The game had only just begun, and she had a rare gift for noticing what others overlooked. Slowly, the first layer of the mystery would peel away, exposing secrets the villagers had tried so carefully to bury. As evening crept in, the townsfolk retired to their homes, their shadows stretching long in the fading light. The police had done what they could, questioning witnesses, securing the scene, and combing for clues. But Miss Marple knew the truth would not be found in the physical evidence, but in the people themselves. Rising from her seat, she moved toward the door, her mind already spinning with possibilities. It was only a matter of time before she found the key to the puzzle, and when she did, St. Mary's would never be the same again. The morning after the murder, the village seemed to have fallen into a strange, unnatural stillness. It was as if the events of the day before had been erased, the sun climbing as innocently as ever, casting long shadows across the cobbled streets.
Yet the villagers carried a quiet unease.
Conversations that had once been open and lively were now hushed, eyes darting as though even the walls might overhear. The death of Miss Parsons had cast a pall that would not lift easily. Miss Marple had spent the night in her small, neat cottage, her thoughts restless. As she had suspected, nothing was as it seemed, and the threads of the case were too tangled to follow all at once. Clues, she knew, had to be unraveled one at a time. The truth never arrived in a sudden flash, it hid in the ordinary, in overlooked moments, in the things people took for granted. With the sun barely over the horizon, Miss Marple set out for the village square, a modest but bustling stretch lined with small shops. Dressed in her usual understated way, a lavender hat perched neatly on her head and a handbag at her arm, she moved with quiet purpose. The ordinariness of her appearance belied the sharp eyes and keen awareness behind it. The constable had spent much of the previous day fumbling through interviews, but Miss Marple knew better than to rely on official channels. It was in the unguarded observations, the unnoticed details, that the truth hid. These villagers were not hardened criminals. They were ordinary people with ordinary fears, desires, and resentments. And it was those hidden truths that would lead her to the killer. She paused outside the butcher's shop, where Mr. Mayfield, a broad-shouldered man with a ruddy face, was slowly wiping down the window. His movements were deliberate, as though yesterday's events still weighed on him.
He glanced up and forced a polite smile.
"Morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff but cordial.
"Good morning, Mr. Mayfield," she replied warmly, her gaze fixed on his.
"I trust the village is settling back to normal after yesterday's events."
Mr. Mayfield's brow furrowed.
I know how these things are, never thought something like that could happen here of all places.
Indeed, Miss Marple murmured, nodding. But she noticed the brief flicker in his eyes, the slight hitch in his words. It wasn't fear of the murder, that would have been expected. This was something else, a deeper unease. Tell me, Mr. Mayfield, she said gently, did you notice anything unusual in the days leading up to Miss Parsons's death?
Anything at all?
You must have seen quite a lot, with so many people passing through your shop. The butcher shifted, glancing down before clearing his throat.
Well,
I don't know as I saw anything, miss, but I did hear tell that Miss Parsons and the doctor, well, they weren't seeing eye to eye.
Least that's what folk were saying. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow.
Oh?
And what sort of talk was that?
Nothing solid, just gossip, he said quickly, wiping his hands on his apron. Some said she was too friendly with other men, and the doctor didn't like it.
But like I said, just talk.
Miss Marple let the silence stretch, her gaze steady. I see. Thank you for sharing that, Mr. Mayfield. Happen to recall anything else, you'll let me know, won't you? Of course, Miss Marple, he replied, though his gaze was already drifting back to his work, eager to lose himself once more in the comfort of the familiar. As Miss Marple went on her way, she felt a small flicker of intrigue. The hint about Miss Parsons and Dr. Parsons was hardly new. It had been whispered through the village for months, perhaps longer, but hearing it from someone with no apparent stake in the matter lent it a curious weight. It was, as the butcher himself had said, mere gossip. Yet in Miss Marple's experience, gossip often held a kernel of truth, buried deep beneath the chatter. She walked on at an unhurried, steady pace toward the local post office. Inside, the postmaster, a mild-mannered fellow named Mr. Thorne, greeted her warmly.
Good morning, Miss Marple. I trust you're well?
As well as can be expected, Miss Marple replied, her tone light though her eyes remained keen. I wondered, Mr. Thorne, if you'd noticed anything unusual over the last few days, perhaps a visitor or a delivery out of the ordinary. Mr. Thorne paused, brow knitting in thought. Well, now you mention it, there was a letter for Miss Parsons last week. Quite a peculiar thing, no return address, only her name scrawled on the front.
She didn't seem too pleased when she took it, either.
I found it strange, but thought little of it at the time. A letter, you say? Miss Marple repeated, interest sharpening. Did she ever speak of it to you? No, she didn't, Mr. Thorne admitted, lowering his voice as if the very mention might stir something unwelcome. But she did look troubled. I thought it might concern the doctor, to tell the truth.
She always seemed unsettled after seeing him.
Miss Marple nodded, tucking the information away. Thank you, Mr. Thorne. If anything else occurs to you, I should be glad to hear it. Of course, Miss Marple, the postmaster said with a respectful nod. Leaving the post office, Miss Marple's mind was alive with speculation. The mystery was beginning to take shape, yet it was far too soon for conclusions. There were too many threads, too many angles. The letter, the talk about Miss Parsons and her husband, the doctor's peculiar manner, all hinted at a deeper story, but the pieces had yet to fit. She continued through the village, watchful and reflective. The reactions she'd seen were telling. Mrs. Bertram's theatrical distress was hard to overlook, but what lay behind her odd fixation on Miss Parsons? Then there was Douglas Fymore, the new solicitor. His aloofness only fueled suspicion, and during questioning, he had not betrayed the slightest flicker of emotion. Was that the mark of guilt, or simply the detachment of one accustomed to human frailty? Many questions still waited for answers, and Miss Marple knew better than to leap ahead. Approaching the green in the heart of the village, she paused, surveying its tranquil scene. Somewhere out there, the clues lay waiting, and in time, she would piece them together. The morning after her discreet inquiries, Miss Marple sat in her small, tidy sitting room, a cup of tea nestled in her hands. The room was as unassuming as she herself, floral cushions neatly arranged, bookshelves lined with well-thumbed novels, mysteries, and a scattering of weathered memoirs. Humble though it was, her cottage was a haven of comfort. But today, her mind refused the peace it offered. The murder of Miss Parsons had stirred a quiet storm through St. Mary's, and Miss Marple felt sure the puzzle pieces were beginning to align, though the final picture remained elusive. She had gathered scraps of gossip and half-formed opinions from the villagers over the past day, yet the key to make it all fall into place still escaped her. The
The strained tie between Miss Parsons and Dr. Parsons, the frosty reserve of Douglas Filemore, all stirred her suspicion, though none yet offered clarity.
It was time to look more closely at her first suspects.
Tea in hand, she considered the two figures who had drawn her focus, Dr. Gerald Parsons and Douglas Fillmore. The doctor, a man closely connected to Miss Parsons, seemed the most obvious suspect given their tension. But Miss Marple knew better than to trust the obvious. Often the truth lay in plain sight, hidden by distraction. Douglas Filemore, too, was curious. Though not woven into the village's social fabric, he had been in St. Mary's long enough to become something of a mystery, keeping the townsfolk at arm's length, yet quietly attentive to the murder's aftermath. His detachment made him a tempting suspect, but Miss Marple knew appearances could deceive. Leaving her tea unfinished, she rose and crossed to the window, scanning the village beyond. Early afternoon lay quiet upon the streets, no trace of the upheaval that had followed the discovery of Miss Parsons's body. Life carried on, seemingly untouched. Yet beneath that calm, she could sense the tension, the quiet dread that clung to every corner.
Stepping outside, she set her course for the doctor's surgery.
Dr. Gerald Parsons's office was a modest, unpretentious building near the heart of the village. It was exactly what one might expect from a country doctor, plain, practical, and devoid of any lavish touches.
Miss Marple rapped lightly on the door before stepping inside.
"Ah, Miss Marple," Dr. Parsons greeted, his tone just a little too taut to sound natural. "What brings you here today?" "I do hope I'm not intruding, Doctor," Miss Marple replied with a pleasant smile. "I simply thought I'd call in to see how you're bearing up after the tragic events of yesterday."
The doctor's face tightened.
"It has been a difficult day."
"Thank you for asking."
Miss Marple settled into the chair opposite his desk, observing him with quiet care. He was a man in his early 40s, his beard prematurely flecked with grey, and his sharp eyes never quite meeting hers. His posture was stiff, his fingers restlessly turning a pen as he sat. "I can only imagine how hard this must be for you," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but deliberate. "You and Miss Parsons were so close, it must have been quite a shock to lose her in such a manner." Dr. Parsons's gaze flickered for the briefest moment before he composed himself again. "Yes, it was unexpected. But these things happen, Miss Marple. Life carries on, doesn't it?" Miss Marple inclined her head, though her eyes remained fixed on him. "Indeed, life does go on. But tell me, Doctor, was there anything unusual in the days before Miss Parsons's death? Anything that might have caused her unease? Something you noticed that didn't seem quite right?"
His hands closed more tightly around the pen.
"Nothing out of the ordinary. She could be difficult at times, yes, but I wouldn't say there was anything that could have led to this." Miss Marple leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial murmur. "But it's true, isn't it, that there were whispers about some friction between you? People have been talking, Doctor." A flush crept into Dr. Parsons's face as he abruptly rose from his chair. "Rumors are just that, rumors, Miss Marple.
I pay them no attention."
"I understand," Miss Marple said softly, her tone almost soothing, as though humoring a fretful child. "But you see, Doctor, rumors often carry a seed of truth. And in this instance, they suggest there's more to your relationship with Miss Parsons than appearances allow." He hesitated, his hand hovering near the door as if weighing an escape. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier. "Is there a purpose to this conversation, Miss Marple?" he asked sharply. Rising from her seat, she offered a gentle smile. "Oh, of course.
I'm sorry if I've caused any discomfort.
I'm merely trying to understand the village's dynamics. Everyone has their secrets, after all.
It's only a matter of time before they surface."
Dr. Parsons said nothing, though the air between them seemed to grow heavier. Miss Marple made for the door, but before leaving, she turned back to him. "I do hope we can speak again soon, Doctor. Perhaps in the coming days you'll recall something that might prove useful." His eyes narrowed, but he gave no reply. Miss Marple stepped out without another word, feeling the weight of the exchange linger behind her. Her next stop in this quiet investigation was Douglas Fillmore. He had kept himself aloof during yesterday's questioning, offering little insight into the tragedy. His detachment stood out amid the village's anxiety, and Miss Marple wondered why he'd chosen to remain so removed. She found him outside his modest home, leaning on the front gate as if waiting for something, or someone. When he spotted her, he gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said politely, though without warmth. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fillmore," she returned, offering a pleasant smile.
"I hope I'm not intruding."
"Not at all," he said, though his tone hinted otherwise. "What can I do for you?"
Miss Marple regarded him for a moment before speaking.
"I simply wished to check in, Mr. Fillmore. The events of yesterday must have shaken you."
"The whole village is unsettled by what happened to Miss Parsons."
He nodded slowly, betraying little emotion. "It's a dreadful thing, of course.
But I hardly knew Miss Parsons. We'd only just been introduced."
Miss Marple studied him closely, noting the subtle shift in his stance. He'd been in the village long enough to know that such a death would touch everyone, whether they knew the victim well or not. Yet he spoke as though it were a remote affair, something far removed from him. "I understand," Miss Marple said, her tone soft but probing. "Still, you were present during the questioning yesterday. It must have been difficult to stand aside while others were so distressed." Fillmore's eyes flickered, but his composure returned almost at once. "I wasn't involved in the drama, Miss Marple. I prefer to keep to myself." "Of course," she said with a nod. "But I can't help finding one thing rather curious, Mr. Fillmore. You were standing by the garden wall, watching the commotion, almost as though you were watching from afar." Fillmore's posture stiffened, and Miss Marple caught the faintest flicker in his eyes. Whether it was guilt, unease, or something else entirely, she couldn't yet tell. "It was a public gathering," he replied evenly. "I watched, yes, but I didn't see anything you'd find of interest." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. "Perhaps not, Mr. Fillmore. But I do wonder if you've noticed something you've yet to share." Fillmore said nothing, but Miss Marple didn't require an answer. She sensed the pieces beginning to align, slowly, subtly, but with growing inevitability. The days following Miss Marple's talks with Dr. Parsons and Douglas Fillmore seemed to stretch endlessly, each hour heavy with suspicion and unease. Though the village maintained a calm exterior, it thrummed with a low, nervous current. Theories swirled in every corner, some wild, others measured. And in the absence of clear facts, whispered speculation filled the void. Gossip, as Miss Marple had long known, was both shield and dagger, hiding truths while revealing others. Her early inquiries had drawn her focus toward two individuals in particular: Dr. Parsons, the ostensibly bereaved husband whose grief carried a sharper edge, and Douglas Fillmore, the aloof newcomer whose detachment made him an easy target for suspicion. Both had behaved oddly in the wake of Miss Parsons's death, though Miss Marple was ever mindful that appearances were a poor judge of truth. That truth often lived in the smallest, most overlooked details, the kind others dismissed without a second thought. Her mind had been restless, chasing half-formed clues that refused to settle, when a trivial, almost laughable moment caught her notice. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that no detail was too slight to matter. Indeed, the tiniest things sometimes unlocked the most elaborate puzzles. On a crisp morning, she resolved to visit Mrs. Bertram once more. Despite her early curiosity about the garden party and its aftermath, Miss Marple had been careful not to dismiss Mrs. Bertram, whose grief and standing in the community might conceal something of worth. The widow's distress over Miss Parsons's death was genuine, yet Miss Marple had sensed an increasing evasiveness in the days since the murder. The Bertram house, once grand and welcoming, now carried an oppressive weight, its walls heavy with secrets and echoes of bygone days. The door creaked softly as Miss Marple entered, the familiar mingling of roses and aged wood greeting her. Mrs. Bertram sat in her customary place by the wide sitting-room window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Miss Marple," she murmured, barely above a whisper. "I wasn't expecting you. Is everything all right?" "I do hope I'm not disturbing you," Miss Marple replied, her tone warm but purposeful. "I thought I might stop in and see how you're faring. I know these days cannot be easy." Mrs. Bertram's eyes dimmed and she released a weary sigh. "It has been dreadful, Jane. Simply dreadful. I cannot fathom how something so terrible could happen here." Her gaze dropped to her hands, which she twisted and untwisted with restless nerves. Miss Marple settled into the chair opposite, offering a sympathetic smile. "I know this must weigh heavily on you, and it's only natural to want answers, to understand how such a thing could happen. But you see, Mrs. Bertram, it is often the smallest things, the subtlest clues, that lead us toward the truth." Mrs. Bertram's brow arched faintly, her hands stilling in her lap. "Clues? Whatever do you mean, Jane?" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice calm yet insistent. I mean those things that seem unimportant at first, the details people overlook when they rush to find an easy explanation. I've been reflecting on how much we hide behind our masks, and how the past quietly shapes our actions in the present. Mrs. Bertram's eyes flickered, and Miss Marple caught the faintest shadow passing over her expression.
Was it fear? Or guilt? She couldn't yet be certain, but it was something she had not noticed before.
I'm not sure I follow you, Mrs. Bertram replied quietly, though tension edged her voice. It's a matter of timing, Miss Marple said, her tone deliberate.
I've been thinking about the garden party.
You were there when Miss Parsons was found, but what about just before?
What did you see?
Or perhaps, what did you not see? Mrs. Bertram shifted uneasily, her fingers tightening against the arms of her chair.
I don't know what you mean, Jane. I've told the police everything. I was only steps away when it happened.
I noticed nothing unusual. Miss Marple inclined her head, her gaze steady. Yes, but there is something rather curious about the door to your study, the one near where Miss Parsons was discovered. Locked from the inside, if I recall. Mrs. Bertram's complexion paled, and she quickly looked away, her eyes fixed on some imagined point beyond the window.
I know very little about that.
I wasn't part of the investigation, Miss Marple.
You really mustn't trouble yourself over such matters.
Miss Marple's smile was gentle but edged with quiet certainty. Ah, but I must, Mrs. Bertram. You see, Miss Marple began, her tone thoughtful, it's the door that troubles me. Locked from the inside, yet Miss Parsons lay in the garden, her body in plain sight of everyone.
How could she have ended up there? And why was that door locked from within?
The question lingered in the air. Miss Marple saw the strain flicker across Mrs. Bertram's face. She was trying to keep her composure, but the veneer was beginning to crack. Her fingers twitched, her gaze darted between Miss Marple and the window. At last, with a weary sigh, Mrs. Bertram spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want anyone to know, but I think I saw something the day before, something that unsettled me. Miss Marple leaned forward, her interest sharpening. What did you see, Mrs. Bertram? Mrs. Bertram hesitated, as though weighing whether to speak. Then, in a hushed tone, she admitted, it was Filemore. He was near the study, standing by the door when Miss Parsons went inside. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, I wonder, why was he there? Why did he seem so intent on watching her? It wasn't like him. Miss Marple's mind raced. Filemore, the solicitor, she'd already noted his curious behavior.
But hearing this from Mrs. Bertram deepened her suspicion. He had been watching Miss Parsons. But why? Could he have played a part in her death?
Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Bertram, Miss Marple said gently, her voice almost a whisper.
This is important. I will, of course, follow up.
Mrs. Bertram nodded, though her face stayed pale and drawn.
I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, Jane. I don't want to stir trouble.
You've done the right thing, Miss Marple assured her, rising from her chair. The truth often lies buried in the most unlikely places. Sometimes, it takes courage to bring it to light. As Miss Marple left the house, she couldn't shake the thought that the locked door was more than just a physical barrier, it was a symbol of the truth itself. Somewhere lay the key, and with it, the answer to the whole mystery. The puzzle pieces were beginning to align, yet much still remained unsolved. Filemore's strange conduct, Mrs. Bertram's guarded admission, and that stubbornly locked door, together they were forming a pattern. But she knew the final revelation would require delicacy. The following days in St. Mary's passed under a curious hush. Life moved on, yet a subtle tension lingered beneath the village's quiet rhythm. Even the familiar comforts, the old bakery on the corner, the laughter of children in the lane, the smell of fresh bread, felt muted, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple, ever the watcher, never let her mind rest. The fragments she'd gathered were beginning to fit into place. The locked door, Mrs. Bertram's carefully chosen words, and Douglas Filemore's unsettling detachment had given her a definite course to follow. Still, there was more to uncover. She already knew more than most villagers suspected. Dr. Parsons, beneath his display of grief, had betrayed a defensive edge, an unspoken tension. Rumors of his troubled marriage to Miss Parsons had proven true. Outward appearances aside, theirs had been a union frayed by strains they refused to face. The doctor, a man accustomed to control, over his practice, his patients, and his home, had withdrawn into denial when that control began to slip. Then there was Douglas Filemore, the aloof newcomer whose chilly reserve had made him an outsider from the moment he arrived. His connection to Miss Parsons, if any, was still uncertain, but his behavior at the garden party, standing rigid against the wall, watching events unfold with that peculiar detachment, was telling. Why had he lingered so quietly in the background? Mrs. Bertram's revelation about seeing him by the study door had sealed Miss Marple's suspicions. He had taken too much interest in Miss Parsons's movements, tracking them too closely. And now, the missing link, the locked study door, was taking on new significance. She had visited Mrs. Bertram again, but the widow had grown unusually reserved, perhaps realizing she had already said too much. The grand house seemed to hold its secrets more tightly than ever. It was time, Miss Marple decided, to speak directly to the key figures. She arrived at Dr. Parsons's surgery just after lunch, her steps measured, her mind calculating the best approach. His manner had become increasingly unpredictable, shifting between outward composure and sudden, inexplicable flashes of agitation. It was time to confront the unspoken truth, the strained marriage between him and his wife, and see whether the real story would finally surface. The door to the surgery gave a slow, complaining creak as Miss Marple stepped inside. Dr. Parsons sat at his desk, brow furrowed in concentration as he scribbled into his ledger. He glanced up at her arrival, eyes narrowing just slightly. "Miss Marple," he said, forcing a polite smile. "What can I do for you today?" "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Miss Marple replied with her usual gentleness. "I simply wish to follow up on a few matters concerning Miss Parsons's tragic passing." At the mention of his wife, Dr. Parsons stiffened, his jaw tightening. "I've already given my statement to the authorities, Miss Marple. There's nothing further to add." Unmoved by his guarded tone, Miss Marple lowered herself into the chair opposite him. "Of course, but you see, Doctor, it's often the things left unsaid that hold the most meaning." He held her gaze for a long, tense moment, and in that instant, she caught the flicker of something, fear, guilt, or perhaps something darker, before he smothered it behind a mask of composure. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully measured. "And what exactly is it you think you know, Miss Marple? If you have questions, they should be for the police. I am simply a man trying to endure the loss of my wife." Miss Marple studied him quietly, eyes thoughtful. "I know you and Miss Parsons were facing difficulties," she said softly. "And I know that when life is not as it appears, people will go to remarkable lengths to shield themselves." Dr. Parsons's expression hardened. He leaned forward, pressing his fingertips into the desk. "I have nothing to hide, Miss Marple. My wife and I had our disagreements, but they were nothing unusual for a married couple. There was no cause for anyone to harm her." "But what if someone believed there was cause?" Miss Marple asked, her voice almost a whisper. "What if they thought she, or you, had wronged them?" The air in the room seemed to chill, silence stretching between them. Abruptly, Dr. Parsons pushed back his chair, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. "I don't need to justify myself to you, Miss Marple. I've told you all I know. You can weave your theories as you please, but they won't change the facts." Miss Marple stayed seated, her gaze unwavering. "No, they won't change the facts. But they may change how those facts are understood." His jaw clenched again, as though a retort hovered on his lips. But instead, he turned away, moving to the window. Miss Marple rose, giving him one last, steady look before she stepped toward the door. "Goodbye, Doctor," she said softly. "I hope you find some peace." Her next call was upon Douglas Filemore. His modest home was well kept, hidden behind a tidy hedge at the village's edge. Miss Marple already knew enough to suspect he was withholding something. Now it was time to hear his explanation. As she approached, the sound of measured footsteps came from within, followed by the faint click of a lock turning. Filemore opened the door, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, voice steady yet tinged with an undercurrent of tension. "What brings you here today?" "I'm afraid I must trouble you again, Mr. Filemore," she said, polite but unyielding. "I have a few questions about your actions during the garden party. I've been thinking over the moments before Miss Parsons was found, and there's one detail that troubles me." Filemore arched an eyebrow, lips curving into a faint, knowing smile. "Oh? And what might that be?" "The door to Mrs. Bertram's study," Miss Marple replied, her tone smooth. "The one locked from the inside. You were seen beside it the day before Miss Parsons's death."
Why were you there, Mr. Filemore? And why take such an interest in her movements?
His smile faltered, and for the first time she saw a flicker in his eyes, fear, perhaps, or guilt. He looked away briefly before returning his gaze to hers. I had my reasons for being there, he said quietly. But you're mistaken if you think I had any hand in her death. Miss Marple tilted her head, studying him. We all have our reasons, Mr. Filemore.
But I believe yours are not yet on the table.
His face darkened, and Miss Marple sensed the endgame was drawing near, though the truth itself felt closer than ever. The days after her confrontations with Dr. Parsons and Douglas Filemore carried an eerie stillness in St. Mary's. On the surface, life resumed its rhythm, as though the shadow cast by Miss Parsons's death had faded.
But Miss Marple knew better.
The truth lingered beneath that veneer, waiting to be uncovered. In both men, she had glimpsed the telltale slip of a mask, a brief, unguarded moment that revealed far more than words. Yet one final piece of the puzzle still eluded her.
Her grasp. She could sense it deep within her bones.
The killer was near, and all that remained was to uncover the final concealed clue that would bind the whole puzzle together. It was a crisp, bright afternoon when Miss Marple resolved to return to the scene of the crime, the study in Mrs. Bertram's home. She had already questioned those who lived there, yet something about that study still called to her. Perhaps it was the door itself, the one locked from within. Something in the way the constable, and later Mrs. Bertram, had described it had never quite settled in her mind.
Why had it been locked from the inside? What secrets might it truly conceal?
Upon reaching the grand house, Miss Marple was met by Mrs. Bertram, wearing the same solemn smile she had worn since the murder. The widow seemed even more withdrawn than before, as if guarding something close to her heart.
And Miss Marple was not the sort to overlook such hints.
Miss Marple, Mrs. Bertram greeted, her voice gentler than usual. I fear I have little more to add to what I've already told you. The village remains in shock, and I'm hardly the one to offer real answers. Not answers, Mrs. Bertram, Miss Marple replied with a quiet patience.
Merely more questions.
You see, I've been thinking about Miss Parsons's death. And I believe there's something within the house, perhaps in the study, that may yield a few more clues. Mrs. Bertram hesitated, a fleeting shadow of unease flickering across her features. Her eyes drifted toward the study door, her lips tightening as though resisting an urge to speak. Miss Marple caught the subtle change, the undercurrent of tension now woven into her expression. I don't know what you expect to find, Miss Marple, Mrs. Bertram said at last, her words slow and deliberate. The door has remained locked since the tragedy.
I thought it best left untouched.
But it is precisely that door that troubles me, Miss Marple said evenly, her voice steady yet insistent. It was locked from inside, you see, and yet Miss Parsons's body was found outside.
What brought her to that door? And what happened in this study that led to her death?
Mrs. Bertram swallowed, her hands trembling faintly as she reached for her tea.
Miss Marple's eyes narrowed.
There was more here than the widow was prepared to admit, something carefully hidden beneath her composure. Might I see the study again, Mrs. Bertram? She asked, her tone low but resolute. For a long moment, Mrs. Bertram was silent. Her gaze moved between Miss Marple and the study door before she finally gave a reluctant nod. Rising from her chair, she led Miss Marple into the room. The study appeared much the same as before, orderly, polished, filled with the warm scent of wood and old paper. But Miss Marple's attention went immediately to the door, that solid, finely crafted piece with its brass handle gleaming dully in the muted light. It's strange, Mrs. Bertram murmured as they stood before it. I locked the door myself when I checked the room that morning.
It was exactly as I left it.
Yet when the constable arrived, the key was still inside.
None of it made sense.
Miss Marple examined the door intently, her mind turning over possibilities. She had long suspected the lock had been tampered with, but the precise method still eluded her.
Miss Parsons had been found outside, yet someone had been in here. Someone who knew how to work the lock without leaving a trace.
I see, Miss Marple said softly.
It is indeed unusual. And perhaps the key is not the only thing in this room worth notice. Mrs. Bertram frowned.
What do you mean, Miss Marple? Stepping toward the desk, Miss Marple let her fingers trail lightly along its edge. A single drawer sat slightly ajar, catching her attention. She remembered seeing it before but had never examined it closely. Now, with the air still and the room hushed, she opened it slowly. Inside were neatly stacked papers, letters, bills, receipts, and, tucked deep at the bottom, a single folded scrap of paper, hidden as if it were never meant to be found. With steady hands, Miss Marple unfolded it. The handwriting was hurried but clear. "I know what you did.
You'll pay for it." Her heart gave a small jolt. The note was damning, but who had written it?
And why had it been hidden away? More pressingly, why had no one discovered it sooner? She turned to Mrs. Bertram, who stood rigid in the doorway, her complexion drained of all color. The widow's eyes flicked from the note to Miss Marple's face, and for the first time, Miss Marple glimpsed genuine fear in them. "Mrs. Bertram," she said quietly, her voice slicing through the heavy air, "who left this note here?" Mrs. Bertram swallowed hard, her throat tightening.
I don't know. I didn't see it before."
"I swear, Miss Marple, I had no idea it was there." But Miss Marple wasn't convinced. The note was a vital piece of evidence, and Mrs. Bertram's reaction was revealing. Miss Marple had long suspected the widow of concealing something, but this was different. This note could be the key to everything, the hidden clue that would finally unlock the mystery of Miss Parsons's death. "It seems we're drawing closer to the truth," Miss Marple murmured, her voice low, almost to herself. "Yet I fear there remains much still to uncover." As she left the study, Miss Marple's mind raced. The note, the locked door, the village tensions, everything was beginning to align in a pattern that left her with a chilling certainty. The killer was far nearer than they had once appeared. But before the final revelation could come, Miss Marple knew she needed to confront one last person. The author of the note, the one who had left the threat in that study drawer. The game was far from over, and Miss Marple was ready to play her final hand. The discovery of the note had been an unexpected turn, one Miss Marple had not anticipated, yet now recognized as the key to solving the mystery of Miss Parsons's death. That evening, seated quietly in her cottage with a paper before her, the words etched upon it echoed in her mind. "I know what you did.
You'll pay for it." Who had written it?
And what, exactly, had they meant by what you did? The clues were slowly coalescing in Miss Marple's mind, and she knew one final confrontation remained. She had her suspicions, naturally, but now it was time to test them. The note, hidden in Mrs. Bertram's desk, had been the missing fragment. Mrs. Bertram's reaction upon its discovery had been revealing, too quick, too defensive. She had tried to deny it, yet something in her eyes betrayed a truth she could not conceal.
There was more to the widow's involvement than met the eye.
But Mrs. Bertram was not the only one under scrutiny. The entire village seemed to guard its secrets. The locked door, the peculiar relationships, the whispered gossip, all pointed toward an intricate web of deception, which Miss Marple had already begun to untangle. There was no time to waste. She needed to confront the widow one final time. Mrs. Bertram had already been given the chance to explain, but now Miss Marple would press for the truth. The truth, after all, was the only path to restore peace to the village and to honor the memory of Miss Parsons. Miss Marple arrived at Mrs. Bertram's house the next morning, just as the sun began to filter softly through the trees. A stillness lingered in the air, as though the house itself were holding its breath in anticipation of the conversation ahead. Mrs. Bertram met her at the door, her face pale and drawn, shadows beneath her eyes betraying a sleepless night. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft, almost apologetic. "I wasn't expecting you today." "I'm afraid I've come to ask a few more questions, Mrs. Bertram," Miss Marple replied, polite yet firm. "We've discussed everything that happened during the garden party, but I believe there is something we have yet to address."
"Something important."
Mrs. Bertram's eyes flickered nervously, and she stepped aside, allowing Miss Marple into the house.
"What is it that you are looking for, Jane? I've already told you everything I know."
Miss Marple did not respond immediately. She took a seat by the window, letting the silence stretch, knowing that silence often made people uneasy. She hoped it would encourage Mrs. Bertram to speak before a direct question was even necessary. After a long moment, Mrs. Bertram shifted in her chair, her gaze lowered.
"I don't know how much more I can tell you. What else could there possibly be?"
"Perhaps we should discuss the note," Miss Marple said gently, yet with unwavering resolve. Mrs. Bertram froze, her face paling. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. She did not speak for some time, and Miss Marple let the pause linger. Finally, Mrs. Bertram whispered, "I never meant for you to find that.
I didn't want anyone to know."
Her words weighed heavily with guilt. "Tell me, Mrs. Bertram," Miss Marple said calmly, "who wrote the note, and what did it signify?" Mrs. Bertram's eyes flickered toward the study door. For a fleeting instant, Miss Marple glimpsed something shift in her expression. Regret, fear, perhaps a hint of shame.
Her fingers twisted nervously in her lap. It was someone I once knew, she said, her voice faltering.
Someone I tried to forget. Miss Marple's gaze never wavered.
Who? Mrs. Bertram. Who was it?
Mrs. Bertram's eyes drifted away. Her voice was barely audible. It was Douglas Fymore. The name lingered in the room, heavy and resonant, echoing against the walls. Miss Marple had suspected as much, yet hearing it aloud sent a chill down her spine. The solicitor, the man who had always seemed so aloof, so distant, he was involved, after all.
But how? And why?
You're saying Douglas Fymore wrote the note? Miss Marple asked, her voice soft yet edged with disbelief.
But why?
What could he possibly want from you? Mrs. Bertram's hands clenched tightly in her lap. It's a long story, Jane. A very long story, one I've tried to bury for years. Miss Marple waited patiently, giving Mrs. Bertram the space to continue. It was years ago, before my husband died, Mrs. Bertram began, her voice trembling slightly. Douglas Fymore was a young man back then, eager to make a name for himself in the village. He was an ambitious solicitor, and I was lonely. My husband, you see, had been ill for years, and I found comfort in Fymore's attention. At first, it was innocent. He offered legal advice, helped me with estate matters, but as time went on, it became more. Miss Marple nodded gently, encouraging her to continue.
More? How?
Mrs. Bertram's eyes flickered nervously around the room. He made advances, subtle at first. He was kind, attentive, and I became attached to him. But when my husband found out, he was furious. Fymore's career was at risk, she continued, and I knew I could not continue the affair. I ended it, and I thought it was over. But it wasn't, Miss Marple said softly, her voice steady.
Mrs. Bertram shook her head. No. Fymore threatened me.
He told me that if I didn't keep quiet, he would ruin me. He knew about my husband's illness, about how vulnerable I had been. I thought I had put it behind me, but when Miss Parsons came to the village, I felt watched again. And then the note arrived. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as the pieces began to align.
Fymore wanted to keep you silent. He wanted to ensure no one discovered his past with you.
But Miss Parsons, she was a threat, wasn't she? She knew his secrets, and when she threatened to expose him, he acted. Mrs. Bertram nodded, tears brimming in her eyes.
I never wanted anyone to be hurt.
I thought it was over, but now I fear it's all come back.
And Miss Parsons, she paid the price for my mistake.
Miss Marple rose slowly, her eyes sweeping the room one last time. The truth, Mrs. Bertram, is always more complicated than we wish it to be, yet it invariably finds its way to the surface. As Miss Marple left Mrs. Bertram's house, clarity settled in her mind. Douglas Fymore had written the note, but it was his fear of exposure and desire to silence Miss Parsons that had driven him to murder. The locked door had been his final attempt to cover his tracks. The pieces were all in place.
All that remained was to confront Fymore and reveal his guilt to the village.
The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Miss Marple's mind had worked tirelessly, unraveling each thread of suspicion, examining every detail. It led to one conclusion. Douglas Fymore had murdered Miss Parsons, driven by the need to bury a past indiscretion with Mrs. Bertram. His desperation had led him to take drastic measures. And yet, even with the truth so apparent, Miss Marple knew she must confront him, not merely to confirm her suspicions, but to observe his reaction. She had gathered the key players, Dr. Parsons, Mrs. Bertram, and now Fymore. Each had offered a piece of the story, but the final piece would emerge only when Fymore faced undeniable evidence of his guilt. As Miss Marple walked toward Fymore's house, the early evening air was crisp, the sky painted with the last hints of daylight. The village lay quiet, the streets still, yet she sensed a storm approaching, one that would soon erupt. Miss Marple already understood Fymore's character. He was methodical, cold, and calculating. He had displayed no panic during the investigation, maintaining the same detached composure that had marked his behavior from the beginning. Yet there was something in his eyes, in his posture, that hinted he knew the walls were closing in. She knocked sharply at his door, the sound echoing through the silence of the evening. Fymore opened it almost immediately, his face composed, though his eyes narrowed at the sight of her. "Miss Marple," he said, voice cool but polite.
I wasn't expecting you. What can I do for you?
I hope I'm not disturbing you, Mr. Fymore, Miss Marple replied, her voice steady.
I've come to speak about something important.
I believe the time has come for a frank conversation. Fymore stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. I'm not sure what you mean, but of course, you are welcome to speak. Miss Marple stepped into the modest, well-kept house, her eyes sweeping the room for any subtle signs of unease. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and the furniture was simple yet refined, reflecting the man's reserved nature. Yet as Miss Marple took in her surroundings, she could not shake the sense of coldness that lingered in the air, a deliberate detachment from the warmth of human connection. Please, have a seat, Fymore said, his voice smooth as he gestured toward the armchair by the fireplace. He settled opposite her, folding his hands neatly in his lap. Miss Marple eased herself into the chair, her posture straight, composed. Mr. Fymore, she began, her voice measured and calm, I've been reflecting on the events that led to Miss Parsons's death. There are still many unanswered questions, but I believe the answers are closer than we realize. He raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. Unanswered questions? I believe everything has been addressed, Miss Marple. The authorities have spoken to me, and I've told them all I know.
There is nothing more to discuss.
Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp and penetrating. You are quite certain of that, Mr. Fymore, are you? Because I have reason to believe there is something you are not telling me, something very important. For the briefest moment, Fymore's calm demeanor wavered. His eyes flicked to the side, and his fingers tightened slightly around the edge of his chair. It was a small reaction, but enough for Miss Marple to notice. Something I'm not telling you, he repeated, his voice still smooth but edged with a subtle defensiveness. I think you are mistaken, Miss Marple. I have no secrets. Ah, but we all have secrets, don't we?
Miss Marple said softly.
Some are simply more difficult to bury than others. For a long moment, Fymore remained silent, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple studied him carefully, her mind working with the precision of a seasoned detective. She knew he was holding something back, trying to maintain control of the conversation. But she had no intention of letting him dictate the narrative. You see, Mr. Fymore, she continued, her voice dropping slightly. The key to understanding what happened to Miss Parsons lies in something very simple, something overlooked by others, yet something that caught my attention.
The note. The word lingered in the air like a bombshell. Fymore's eyes darkened immediately.
His reaction was sharp and swift. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. And for the first time, Miss Marple saw the flicker of fear in his gaze.
What note? He asked, his voice tight. Miss Marple did not flinch.
The note hidden in Mrs. Bertram's study, the one meant for her.
I know what you did. You will pay for it.
Fymore's face went pale. For a brief moment, the composed solicitor vanished, replaced by a man teetering on the edge, struggling to maintain his self-control. His hand clenched into a fist, his jaw tightening.
How did you find it?
He asked, his voice low and strained. I have my ways, Miss Marple replied gently, a small smile on her lips.
But it was never about how I found it. The question is who left it there, and why.
Fymore stared at her, breath quickening. For a moment, it seemed he might speak, but instead he rose abruptly and began pacing the room, his agitation growing with every step. You don't know what you're talking about, he muttered to himself, as if trying to convince his own mind. It's all just rumors, lies. Is it, Mr. Fymore?
Miss Marple interjected firmly.
Because from where I stand, it seems you've been running from the truth for a long time. And the truth has a way of catching up, doesn't it? Fymore stopped pacing, his back to her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Miss Marple watched him closely, waiting for him to make the first move. He was cornered, and he knew it. Finally, he turned to face her, his face pale but resolute. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, he said, voice thick with guilt. I never meant for anyone to die, but she was going to ruin everything.
She had to be stopped.
Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat as the words fell from his lips. Who was going to ruin everything, Mr. Fymore? She asked softly. Miss Parsons, he replied, his voice breaking. She was going to expose me. She knew about the affair with Mrs. Bertram, everything. And when she threatened to tell the village, I couldn't let that happen. I thought, if I could scare her, make her back off, but she wouldn't listen. The silence that followed was suffocating. Fimore's confession hung heavily in the room, and though Miss Marple had long suspected the truth, she felt a pang of sorrow. He had been a man driven to the edge, a man whose secrets had destroyed him. "How did you do it?" Miss Marple asked quietly, her tone almost compassionate.
"I locked the door," he whispered, hollowly. "And I waited. I knew she would come to the study."
"She always did, and when she went inside, I locked it behind her. I wanted her to believe she was trapped, that there was no escape."
"But she did not die immediately. She must have struggled to get out, yet the door would not yield."
Then he trailed off, his face folding inward with remorse. Miss Marple nodded slowly, a weight settling over her heart as she realized that Fillmore had indeed committed the crime. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Fillmore," she said softly, though there was no triumph in her tone. "The truth is always the hardest thing to confront, but it is the only thing that can truly liberate us." As Miss Marple departed from Fillmore's house, she understood that the last act of this long and tragic narrative had been played out. The village of St. Mary's would never be quite the same again. Yet with the perpetrator finally revealed, the oppressive shadow that had hung over the town would gradually lift, and, as always, Miss Marple would quietly recede into the background, satisfied that another mystery had been unraveled, another truth brought to light. The morning following Miss Marple's confrontation with Douglas Fillmore found St. Mary's in an unusual quiet. The usual hum of village life had slowed, morning fog lingering stubbornly in the narrow lanes, as if the town itself held its breath. Miss Marple had done what she did best, disentangled the intricate threads of tragedy, uncovered the hidden truths, and delivered justice to the guilty. Now remained only the final, inevitable step, the reveal. The village square, ordinarily bustling with life, was nearly deserted. Miss Marple observed from her small cottage window, sunlight now piercing through the dissipated fog, casting elongated shadows over the cobblestones. A scene of peace, but Miss Marple knew that tranquility often concealed its own subtle dangers. The storm had passed, yet the damage lingered.
A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts.
She turned, eyes sharp, moving to answer. It was time to tie up the last loose threads, and the man at the door would help take the final step toward the truth.
"Good morning, Miss Marple," said Officer Cooley, the village constable.
Young, earnest, and often daunted by the complexities of true crime, he offered a tentative smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you."
"Not at all, Officer Cooley," Miss Marple replied warmly.
"Come in, please. I believe we have much to discuss." Cooley stepped inside, his brow furrowed with concern. He had always treated Miss Marple with respect, even if he had never fully grasped the depths of her insight. Today, however, a nervous tension clung to him, as though he anticipated a storm breaking. "I've been thinking about the case," Cooley began, his voice hesitant.
"And I feel we've overlooked something.
I can't quite place it, but it seems something's off.
Could you help me see what I might be missing?"
Miss Marple nodded, gesturing to the chair by the window. "Of course, Officer Cooley. Let us sit, and I will share what I have discerned." They took their seats, and Miss Marple inhaled deeply before speaking, her voice calm but unwavering. "The truth, Officer Cooley, is simple at its core. The difficulty lies only in peeling back the layers of deception that conceal it. What we face is both a tragedy and a meticulously constructed lie.
And it is the lie that has kept the truth hidden from this village."
Cooley listened intently, narrowing his eyes as she continued.
"Miss Parsons's death was no random act.
It was a calculated measure taken by someone whose secrets were threatened. The killer had much to lose and believed they could manipulate the situation, keep their actions concealed, and escape unscathed." "Who was it?" Cooley asked, voice taut with anticipation. "Douglas Fillmore," Miss Marple said steadily. "He is the one who killed Miss Parsons." Cooley's face drained of color, and he shifted uneasily. But he seemed so calm throughout the investigation.
"He never appeared guilty."
"Exactly," Miss Marple replied. "That composure is precisely what made him stand out. While the rest of the village reeled in shock and confusion, he remained aloof, detached. It was not indifference, it was foreknowledge.
He had planned everything."
"But how can you be so certain?" Cooley asked, incredulity threading his voice. "What gives you that certainty?" Miss Marple leaned forward, eyes intent. "Because of one simple detail, the locked door." "The locked door?"
Cooley repeated, perplexed. But that was surely an accident.
The key remained inside, and Miss Parsons must have tried to escape.
Miss Marple shook her head gently.
No, officer.
The locked door was intentional. It was never an oversight.
The killer locked it from the inside, knowing she would be trapped. And then he waited, knowing she would be unable to free herself.
Cooley's eyes widened as comprehension dawned. But why? Why Miss Parsons? What could she have known that drove Fillmore to such extremes?
She knew everything. Miss Marple replied, her voice softening. She had uncovered the affair between Mrs. Bertram and Fillmore. She had been quietly observing, piecing together the truths the villagers overlooked. The hidden tensions. When she realized what was happening, she threatened to expose it all. And Fillmore, Cooley said, his voice low with dawning comprehension.
Exactly, Miss Marple replied.
He knew that once Miss Parsons spoke out, his secret would be revealed, and everything he had built, his reputation, his carefully maintained image, would be destroyed.
So he made certain she couldn't tell anyone.
He locked her in the study and waited for her panic, for her futile attempts to escape.
But in the end, it wasn't the door that killed her. It was his desperation. He killed her because she threatened everything he valued.
Cooley was silent for a long moment, absorbing the weight of Miss Marple's words. But how did you figure it out, Miss Marple? He asked finally. It wasn't just the door, Miss Marple said, her voice quiet yet unwavering. It was the note. The note. Cooley repeated, puzzled. What note? The note found in Mrs. Bertram's study, Miss Marple explained. The one hidden in the drawer.
The one that read, I know what you did. You'll pay for it.
That note was intended for Mrs. Bertram, but Fillmore never accounted for Miss Parsons discovering it. And when she did, she must have realized the walls were closing in on him.
That was when he decided to act.
Cooley's jaw dropped as the significance of the note became clear. So Fillmore was threatening Mrs. Bertram, and Miss Parsons found out.
Exactly, Miss Marple confirmed.
And in the end, it was that very threat that led to Miss Parsons's death. Fillmore tried to control the situation, but his fear of exposure drove him to murder. Cooley stood abruptly, his mind racing with the implications of Miss Marple's revelation. We need to arrest him, Miss Marple.
I can't believe I didn't see it before.
But now, with all the pieces in place, it's undeniable. Fillmore is guilty. Yes, Miss Marple said, rising gracefully to her feet.
But it isn't simply about arresting him. It's about understanding the why.
The tragedy here is not only that Miss Parsons was killed, but that someone allowed their fear to destroy everything they had. Fillmore's guilt lies not merely in the murder itself, but in choosing his secrets over all else. Cooley nodded, his expression grim with the gravity of the realization. I'll go to the station.
I'll take care of it.
As he turned to leave, Miss Marple observed him with a soft, knowing smile. I'm sure you will, Officer Cooley. But remember this, justice is only part of the equation. The true cost of guilt is always far higher than we imagine. Cooley gave her a final, grateful nod before stepping through the door. Miss Marple watched him go, feeling the quiet satisfaction that comes with resolving another case. And as St. Mary's slowly began to heal, she knew that the gentle rhythm of village life would resume. The secrets were exposed, the truth laid bare, and the community would find its peace once more. Yet Miss Marple also knew that within the depths of human nature, there would always be another mystery to solve, another truth to uncover, and she would be ready, as ever, to bring it into the light. The days following Fillmore's arrest carried a peculiar quiet. St. Mary's, though small and secluded, had always harbored a calm undercurrent. Its silent lanes and cobblestone streets offered a gentle sanctuary from the wider world. Yet in the wake of the murder and its revelations, a weight lingered, a tangible sense that things had irrevocably shifted. Miss Marple sat in her customary spot by the window of her cozy cottage, the familiar vistas of the village stretching before her. The soft rustle of leaves, the faint hum of voices from the market square, it all seemed ordinary. Yet Miss Marple knew better than most that appearances could be deceiving. Beneath the surface of even the most tranquil villages lie untold stories, sometimes harboring the darkest truths. As she basked in the late afternoon light, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the case. The pieces had fallen seamlessly into place, each thread of suspicion meticulously woven. She had suspected Douglas Fillmore from the start, but the path to the truth had proven longer than anticipated. The locked door, the hidden note, the strained relationships, all pointed unmistakably to Fillmore.
But it was only through careful unraveling that the man was fully exposed for what he truly was.
Miss Marple had always known the most difficult part of any case was not discovering the culprit, but comprehending the consequences of that revelation. For the people involved, those whose lives were irreversibly changed, nothing would ever be the same. Her reverie was interrupted by a gentle knock at the door. She rose gracefully from her chair, smoothing her dress as she moved toward it. Upon opening, she was met with the familiar face of Officer Cooley. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, his voice softer than usual. "May I come in?" "Of course, Officer Cooley," she replied, stepping aside. "Please, make yourself comfortable." Cooley entered the cottage, his habitual nervous energy replaced by a subdued calm. The weight of the investigation had been heavy, and Miss Marple knew the burden of the case had been felt deeply. Now, with Fillmore in custody, there was a sense of closure, for the village, if not the man himself. "I wanted to come by and thank you," Cooley said, settling into the armchair opposite her. "I don't think I could have solved this case without your guidance. Your insight, your observations, they all came together perfectly in the end." Miss Marple smiled gently, a touch of sadness lingering in her eyes. "I merely helped connect the dots, officer. It was you who took the final steps, who ensured that justice was served. Yet I understand how burdensome it all must feel. A case like this, so enmeshed in secrets and deception, it's hard not to ponder the true cost of truth." Crawley shifted uneasily in his chair, his gaze dropping for a moment. "I keep thinking about it, Miss Marple, about those left behind. Miss Parsons, she did not deserve her fate. And now, with Fillmore in custody, I cannot help but wonder if this was more than just a crime born of fear and desperation." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes reflecting quiet contemplation. "What do you mean, officer?" Crawley lifted his gaze, pain etched across his face. "I mean, every life has its deeper story, does it not? Fillmore, yes, he is guilty, but he was not always so. Something must have brought him to this point. He was once a young, promising solicitor, full of promise. And Mrs. Bertram, she, too, was ensnared in the chaos. She was a victim in her own right." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her expression solemn. "That is true, officer. Mrs. Bertram was ensnared by her own circumstances. She allowed herself to be drawn into Fillmore's world, trusting in promises he could never honor. Yet, as I have often said, the truth is rarely simple, and even the most tragic figures must ultimately bear the consequences of their choices." Silence fell between them, both absorbing the weight of her words. The village, for all its serene facade, had been shaken to its core. The murder of Miss Parsons was more than a crime, it had unearthed the darker truths long buried beneath placid surfaces. And now, with Fillmore behind bars and villagers returning to their routines, the lingering question remained. What had they truly learned? The following day, Miss Marple attended the modest service for Miss Parsons at Mayo Village Church. It was a quiet gathering, the villagers assembling solemnly to honor the woman they had lost. Despite the sorrow, a sense of healing permeated the air, a fragile unity forming as the community mourned together. Miss Marple sat at the back, her eyes resting on the casket adorned with flowers. She observed the villagers filing in, faces somber yet composed. Each carried unseen burdens, unspoken secrets, and Miss Marple understood that this tragedy would alter them, perhaps in ways they would only realize in time. As the service concluded and the congregation began to leave, Miss Marple remained seated, her gaze lingering on the altar. Only then did she feel a gentle tap on her shoulder. Turning, she saw Dr. Parsons standing there, his expression a mixture of guilt and resignation. "Miss Marple," he said softly, "I wanted to thank you. I cannot imagine how this could have been resolved without your guidance." Miss Marple regarded him with gentle eyes. "Dr. Parsons, I understand your grief, but you must see that this loss, as heartbreaking as it is, concerns more than Miss Parsons alone. It speaks to the choices we all make, and the inevitable consequences that follow." Dr. Parsons lowered his gaze, shadowed by regret. "I failed her, Miss Marple. I failed her as a husband, as a man. I should have seen. I should have known what was happening, yet I could not bring myself to face the truth." Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on his arm, her voice soft but steady. "We all falter, Dr. Parsons. It is human. But it is how we choose to move forward after failure that defines us." He nodded slowly, his eyes distant as he absorbed her words. Then, after a pause, he looked back at her. "I believe. I understand. I must live with this, yet I will strive to do better, for myself and for her memory.
Miss Marple offered a small, knowing smile. That is all anyone can do, Dr. Parsons.
As she stepped from the church, the village square stretched before her, transformed. The faces of its inhabitants seemed lighter, the shadow of suspicion lifting. Yet Miss Marple knew the truth, once uncovered, was not always gentle. For some, it offered clarity. For others, only regret. The case had concluded, but the village, and its people, would never be quite the same. And Miss Marple, as always, would fade quietly into the background, leaving only her patient observations, her measured reasoning, and her unwavering pursuit of the truth. For now, the village rested. Yet she knew all too well that shadows return, that the next mystery, the next truth awaiting revelation, was never far, and when it emerged, she would be ready. The morning sun had fully risen over St. Mary's, casting a soft, golden light across the village. The square lay tranquil, as it often did in early hours, yet the atmosphere felt subtly altered. The tragedy had passed, but its echoes lingered. The villagers, though still marked by Miss Parsons' death, appeared to move forward, each bearing the weight of the recent weeks like a silent burden. Miss Marple understood, however, that moving on was never simple. The stillness of St. Mary's had been disturbed, and though time might blur the edges of sorrow, a ripple remained, forever altering the village's fabric. She sat at her small writing desk, hands folded in thoughtful repose. No new developments had arisen, no further secrets demanded uncovering. Fillmore remained in custody, and the villagers had resumed their routines. The garden party, the murder, the aftermath, all seemed to fade into memory as though they had never occurred. Yet Miss Marple knew better than to trust in easy endings. Though the case was solved, an unspoken question lingered, unresolved. There was more to it, and it was not merely about the murder. It was about the people, the ones left behind, and the truths they had yet to confront. Just as she was about to reflect further, a gentle knock at the door broke her train of thought. Miss Marple rose from her chair, smoothing the folds of her dress as she moved toward the door. She opened it to find Mrs. Bertram standing on the doorstep, her face drawn and weary, yet still carrying her customary air of dignity. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Bertram said softly, her voice hesitant. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Mrs. Bertram," Miss Marple replied warmly, though a note of concern lingered in her tone. "Please, come in." Mrs. Bertram stepped inside with measured movements, as if the weight of the world pressed upon her shoulders. The past few weeks had aged her, and a faint tremor in her hand betrayed the heaviness still pressing on her heart. Though Fillmore had confessed, she seemed unable to shake the lingering shadows of her own past. Miss Marple gestured toward a chair. "I trust you've been managing, given the circumstances." Mrs. Bertram offered a small, weary smile. "Well enough, Miss Marple, but that's not why I've come. I've been reflecting deeply on the events of recent weeks, and I feel compelled to offer an explanation. One last truth that must be spoken before we all move on." Miss Marple remained quiet, her eyes fixed on the woman before her. She had long suspected there was more to Mrs. Bertram's story, a hidden layer of guilt and confusion yet to be faced. "Please," Miss Marple said gently. "Speak freely. I'm listening." Mrs. Bertram drew a deep breath, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. "I've never been one to speak of my past, Miss Marple," she began, her voice low, weighted with regret. "But now I feel I must. Fillmore's actions, his cruelty, it was all because of me. I was the one who set him on this path, and I must bear that burden." Miss Marple remained composed, her gaze unwavering. "Go on, Mrs. Bertram. Tell me what's on your mind." Mrs. Bertram hesitated, her eyes distant, as though revisiting the events in her memory. "It wasn't merely an affair, you see. Not a fleeting indiscretion. I loved him. I loved Douglas Fillmore in a way I hadn't loved my husband in years. With him, I felt alive. Seen. I was lonely, Miss Marple. Lonely in a way I hadn't been for years. My husband's long illness left me with no one to confide in, no one to lean on. Fillmore offered me that, and I let myself fall into it." Miss Marple's eyes softened in understanding. "Loneliness can lead one to choices one might never make otherwise. It is a powerful, compelling force, Mrs. Bertram." Mrs. Bertram nodded slowly, her gaze falling. "But that is not what I regret. What haunts me is my blindness to what it was doing to him, to Douglas. He was ever ambitious, eager to climb higher, to control everything. And when he realized Miss Parsons was growing too close, that she might expose everything, he snapped.
I never imagined it would come to this.
I never imagined he'd kill her. Do you believe he did it for you? Miss Marple asked softly, probing, but without judgment. Tears welled in Mrs. Bertram's eyes, yet she did not cry. She nodded slowly, her face weary.
Yes.
In a twisted way.
I believe he did it for me. For us.
He feared losing me, not after all we had shared. And he thought that eliminating Miss Parsons would restore normalcy, allow him to bury the past and move forward. And you, Mrs. Bertram?
Miss Marple asked gently.
Do you still love him? The question seemed to take her by surprise. She looked up at Miss Marple, her eyes a mixture of sorrow and resignation.
I don't know, Miss Marple. I no longer know what love is.
My life has been entangled in lies and regrets, and now I feel I have lost the capacity to feel anything truly. I loved him, yes, but I also feel pity. Pity for what he has become, for what we have all become. Miss Marple gave a quiet sigh, her heart heavy with empathy. You have borne a great burden, Mrs. Bertram. But it is never too late to begin anew. Even now, you may seek redemption, and live free from the shadows of the past. For the first time in weeks, Mrs. Bertram's eyes held a glimmer, perhaps of hope, perhaps of willingness to confront the truth.
I know, she said softly.
I don't know where to begin. By telling the truth, Miss Marple replied, her voice firm yet kind. You've already taken the first step by facing it.
The rest will come in time.
Later that afternoon, after Mrs. Bertram had departed, Miss Marple sat quietly at her desk, reflecting on their conversation. The case, though resolved, had uncovered far more than a single murder. It had revealed the deep wounds of the human heart, the hidden regrets, and the choices that had driven people along dark, unforeseen paths. And yet, Miss Marple knew that these very flaws, these struggles, this capacity for both profound love and terrible error, were what made people human. The truth, she realized, was always more complex than it appeared, but it remained the truth nonetheless. As the day faded into evening, Miss Marple gazed out over the village one last time, her heart quietly satisfied. St. Mary's remained unchanged in appearance, yet beneath the surface it had been irrevocably altered. And Miss Marple, as always, would remain its silent observer, watching, waiting, knowing that another mystery would surely call her again. The days following Mrs. Bertram's visit passed in a gentle blur. The immediate weight of the mystery that had gripped the village for weeks had lifted, yet the threads of the case lingered in Miss Marple's mind, entangled with the lives of those she had come to know so well. The manner in which each villager had responded, some deflecting, others retreating into denial, remained lodged in her thoughts, gnawing at her quietly. The village's routine slowly resumed, yet undercurrents of unease persisted. Faces in the market square carried a new caution, a heightened awareness of hidden truths still unspoken, even as a subtle relief seemed to hover in the air, like the clearing of a storm, however temporary. One afternoon, as Miss Marple strolled through the quiet lanes of St. Mary's, she sensed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The streets were unusually hushed, the customary hum of activity replaced with a peculiar stillness, as though the village collectively waited for something. She could not shake the feeling that the storm had not yet fully passed. Approaching the familiar stone bench in the small park, she noticed a solitary figure seated there, Dr. Gerald Parsons. He was hunched slightly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Absorbed in his thoughts, he had not noticed her approach. Miss Marple took a quiet seat beside him, mindful not to disturb the stillness. "Good afternoon, Doctor," she said softly, her voice cutting gently through the silence. Dr. Parsons looked up, startled, but upon seeing her, he gave a small, weary smile.
"Ah, Miss Marple. I didn't expect anyone here at this hour. I suppose I've been lost in my thoughts."
Miss Marple nodded, observing him closely. His features were etched with fatigue, his usual composure had given way to a quiet, almost fragile weariness that aged him beyond his years. A man once steadfast, he now seemed unraveling, preoccupied with something Miss Marple could not yet discern. "I trust you are finding some peace, after everything," she said gently. Dr. Parsons hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the distant horizon. "I don't know, Miss Marple. I thought that once Fymore was caught, the weight would lift, that life would return to normal, but it hasn't. The village feels different, and so do I. I cannot stop thinking about what happened, about what I could have done differently. Miss Marple studied him carefully, noting the faint tremor in his hands resting on his lap. His grief, she realized, extended beyond Miss Parsons. It was grief for himself, for the life he had led and the choices he had made. A life built upon a facade of perfection, while hiding secrets that inevitably came to light. "Doctor," she said after a thoughtful pause, "sometimes the truth lies not in the actions themselves, but in the choices we make in response. It is easy to become ensnared in regret, to wish we could undo the past. But the only thing we can truly alter is the path we take moving forward." He turned toward her, eyes filled with sorrow and uncertainty. "I do not know how to move forward, Miss Marple. My late wife, she was not the woman I thought I knew. She had her secrets, as I had mine. How does one reconcile that? How do I reconcile the man I once was with the man I am now?" Miss Marple drew a deep breath, her gaze steady. "That, doctor, is the most difficult part. Reconciliation. You may not find peace in the manner you expect, but it will come when you stop fleeing from the truth about yourself, your choices, and the people you have loved." Dr. Parsons looked down, jaw tightening as he absorbed her words. A long silence followed, broken only by his quiet, almost whispered voice. "I do not know if I can face that truth, Miss Marple. I fear it may destroy me." "Only if you allow it," she said softly. "Facing the truth does not mean destroying what remains. It means understanding it, and finding a way to live with it." For a long moment, they sat in silence, each contemplating the weight of their conversation. Miss Marple knew Dr. Parsons was not yet ready to accept the full measure of his loss, nor the role he had played in it. Yet she also understood that simply voicing the truth could begin the journey toward reconciliation. Footsteps interrupted their quiet, and Miss Marple looked up to see Mrs. Bertram approaching. Her posture was stiff, yet her face bore none of the usual composure. Each step was measured and deliberate, as if she, too, carried a heavy burden. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," Mrs. Bertram said softly, her eyes revealing an unexpected depth of emotion. She paused upon reaching the bench, casting a weary glance at Dr. Parsons before she settled onto the bench beside him. "Doctor, I trust you are well." Dr. Parsons nodded, though his expression remained distant. "I'm managing, Mrs. Bertram. And you? How are you holding up?" Mrs. Bertram did not respond immediately. She simply stared ahead, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Miss Marple observed her with quiet attentiveness, sensing that there was something she wanted to say but was unsure how to begin. "You know, Miss Marple," Mrs. Bertram said at last, breaking the silence, "I've spent my life pretending that everything was fine, that I was in control of my circumstances. But now I see that pretending doesn't work. The truth always rises to the surface." Miss Marple nodded gently. "It does, Mrs. Bertram. The truth always emerges in the end." Mrs. Bertram sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "I know, and I've been thinking about what you said regarding facing the truth. I'm not sure I'm ready, but I know I must be. I can't keep hiding from what I've done, or from what I've allowed to happen." Dr. Parsons shifted uncomfortably beside her. "We all have regrets, Mrs. Bertram. We've all made mistakes, but we must find a way to live with them." "I know," she whispered. "But it's not just the mistakes, is it? It's the things we've left unsaid, the things we've hidden, believing they would never come to light." Miss Marple's gaze moved between Mrs. Bertram and Dr. Parsons, sensing that they were finally beginning to confront the truths they had long avoided. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the most painful truths are those we've hidden from ourselves, yet they can also be the ones that set us free." A long pause followed, and then Mrs. Bertram rose, her expression resolute. "I need to go," she said quietly. "I must face what I've done. I need to speak to my son and to those I've hurt." Dr. Parsons watched her, his face etched with quiet understanding. "I understand, Mrs. Bertram. I believe we both do." As Mrs. Bertram walked away, Miss Marple remained seated, her eyes following her until she disappeared from view. She knew the path ahead would be difficult, perhaps even painful. Yet, for the first time in many years, both Mrs. Bertram and Dr. Parsons appeared to be taking the initial steps toward healing, and that, Miss Marple thought, was the best anyone could hope for. The village of St. Mary's was at its most peaceful in the late afternoon, as the sun slipped behind the hills and long shadows stretched across the cobblestones. There was a stillness here, a quiet that seemed unique to this place. Miss Marple often found solace in such moments that followed a storm. But as she walked through the village that afternoon, she sensed an unfamiliar weight in the air, something lingering just beyond her grasp. The case was concluded. The truth had been revealed. Douglas Fillmore was behind bars, and the village, though shaken, was beginning to move forward. Yet Miss Marple knew that the aftermath of such revelations was never so clean-cut. People never escape their pasts entirely. They carry their secrets, whether acknowledged or not. And though Fillmore had confessed, the emotional and psychological scars left by his deeds would not simply vanish. Her steps were measured as she made her way down the village lane, passing the familiar houses and shops. She had not expected calm to arrive so swiftly, yet it had, as if the village had drawn a deep breath and released it in quiet, collective relief. The once tense atmosphere had faded, leaving a lingering sense of change, a gentle reckoning. Approaching the small green at the village center, she noticed a familiar figure seated alone on the bench, back slightly hunched, eyes fixed on the distance. It was Dr. Gerald Parsons, looking wearier than ever. Miss Marple had observed him in the village square over the past few days, often walking alone, his gaze distant, his movements slower than before. She could feel the weight of everything he had endured, persisting despite the resolution of the case. She approached quietly, knowing her presence would not startle him. Dr. Parsons, once a man of composed reactions, now carried a vulnerability she had never seen. He looked up as she neared, offering a small, weary smile. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, voice gentle but tinged with fatigue. "I was wondering if you might come by." Miss Marple returned his smile and sat down beside him. "I didn't expect to see you out here today, Dr. Parsons. It has been a difficult few weeks, hasn't it?" He nodded slowly, eyes drifting toward the horizon. "I cannot say I've found peace yet, Miss Marple. The case may be resolved, but I feel trapped in its aftermath, unsure where I stand." Miss Marple regarded him with soft understanding. "I think the hardest part is not facing the consequences of your actions, but the consequences of your silence. You've been carrying a heavy burden, Dr. Parsons, and I know it is not easy to come to terms with it." He sighed, a deep, almost defeated sound. "I never realized how much I had been hiding from myself, from everyone. The affair, my neglect of Miss Parsons, the lies I told myself, they've all come back to haunt me. I thought I could bury them, but they resurfaced, and now I don't know how to live with it." Miss Marple regarded him for a long moment before speaking. "It's not about burying the past, Doctor. It's about facing it and deciding to change. You cannot undo what's been done, but you can choose how to move forward." Dr. Parsons shook his head. "I don't know how to move forward, Miss Marple. What kind of man am I now? I wasn't there when Miss Parsons needed me most, and I failed her. I failed myself." "You are not the only one who failed her, Doctor," Miss Marple said softly. "We all have our regrets, but it's never too late to change. The truth may have come too late for Miss Parsons, but it's not too late for you." The doctor remained silent for a moment, staring at the ground. Then he looked up at Miss Marple, his expression steadier than before. "You're right. Of course, it's just hard to accept. I can never undo what's been done, but perhaps I can try to do better. For myself, for her memory." Miss Marple offered a small, knowing smile. "That's all anyone can do, Doctor. You can't undo the past, but you can learn from it and try to make amends where possible." Dr. Parsons nodded slowly, as if a weight had shifted slightly from his shoulders. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I needed to hear that." As the conversation faded into silence, Miss Marple reflected on what had transpired: the doctor's guilt, his struggle with the truth, and his tentative acceptance of the consequences of his actions. It was a process she had witnessed many times before, yet it never became any easier to observe. The human heart was a complicated thing, and even the best-intentioned people could become ensnared in webs of their own making. Miss Marple sat quietly beside Dr. Parsons, watching as the sun continued its slow descent, bathing the village in warm, golden light. The quiet was comforting, but she knew beneath this calm, much remained to be done. The villagers would carry their scars with them. Some would take longer than others to confront their truths. She looked at Dr. Parsons again, and for the first time, she noticed a flicker of something in his eyes, a sense of resolve, a willingness to take responsibility for his past and move forward. It was not an easy path, but it was a necessary one. As the evening light grew dimmer, Miss Marple rose, her movements slow but deliberate. "I think it's time for me to be on my way, Doctor," she said quietly. "But remember, the truth may be difficult to face, yet it is the only thing that can set us free." Dr. Parsons stood as well, his expression thoughtful, yet more at peace than before.
"Thank you, Miss Marple. You've helped me more than you know."
With a final nod, Miss Marple turned and walked away, her heart heavy with the knowledge that, though the case was solved, the real work of healing and reconciliation had only just begun. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, the warm glow of the fire casting long shadows across the walls. She had spent the afternoon talking to Dr. Parsons, yet her mind remained restless. There was a lingering sense that something remained unresolved, something still hanging in the air, waiting to be addressed.
Her thoughts drifted to Mrs. Bertram.
The widow had left the village for a time, presumably to manage the aftermath of the affair with Fior, yet Miss Marple knew she would return. Everyone in St. Mary's would eventually have to face their truths, whether they were ready or not. And as much as Miss Marple wished she could offer a quick solution, she knew that some things required time. There was no easy path to redemption, and the road to peace was often long. But in the quiet of her cottage, she trusted that the people of St. Mary's would find their way, even if it meant confronting the darkest corners of their hearts. And when the next mystery arose, which she knew it would, Miss Marple would meet it with the same quiet determination that had guided her through so many before. The serene peace of St. Mary's, once shattered by the tragic events surrounding Miss Parsons's murder, had returned. Yet, like the lingering mist that clung to the hills in early morning, a subtle unrest remained in the village. The case was over, Fior imprisoned, and life slowly returning to its routines. Yet the small, imperceptible shifts in the hearts and minds of the villagers lingered. Change, Miss Marple knew, often followed truth, but it did not arrive easily. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Miss Marple once again found herself in the village square. The streets were quiet, the shops shuttered for the day, and only a few villagers wandered the lanes.
She felt a fragile calm in the air.
The village had returned to its routine, yet for some, those whose lives had been irreversibly altered in recent weeks, that normality remained beyond reach. She was about to turn toward her cottage when she noticed a familiar figure walking slowly down the street. It was Mrs. Bertram, looking more fragile than Miss Marple had ever seen her. The widow was clad in black, her hands clasped tightly before her as she walked, head slightly bowed. Something in her posture, an air of quiet resignation, made Miss Marple pause. The woman had changed since the revelation of her affair with Fior, and though the truth had been exposed, it was evident that Mrs. Bertram had not yet come to terms with what had been revealed. Miss Marple waited patiently for her to approach, and when Mrs. Bertram saw her, she paused, offering a small, tight smile. A faint shadow of sadness lingered in her eyes, quickly masked by the composed facade she had always maintained.
"Good afternoon, Miss Marple," she said softly.
"I wasn't expecting to see you today."
"Good afternoon, Mrs. Bertram," Miss Marple replied, her voice warm yet discerning. "I thought I'd catch up with you."
"How are you, truly?" Mrs. Bertram sighed, her gaze drifting toward the distant horizon as if seeking answers in the quiet landscape. "I'm managing," she admitted, her voice heavy with an unmistakable weariness. "But it hasn't been easy. There are still things I'm trying to understand, not just Fior's actions, but my own mistakes as well." Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her tone remained steady. "We all carry regrets, Mrs. Bertram.
But it's not about undoing the past.
It's about the choices we make now, the steps we take toward reconciliation. The past cannot be changed, but the way forward is ours to decide." Mrs. Bertram nodded slowly, eyes distant.
"I've been thinking about that, Miss Marple.
I've spent so much of my life pretending to be someone I wasn't, striving to control everything, maintaining appearances. But the truth, it always finds a way to the surface, no matter how deeply we try to bury it." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "The truth has a way of finding us. And when it does, we must decide how to confront it. You've taken the first step, Mrs. Bertram, by acknowledging what has happened. Facing the past is never easy, but it's the only way to find peace." For a long moment, neither spoke. The village lay quiet around them, the stillness almost tangible. Miss Marple felt the weight of Mrs. Bertram's internal struggle. Years of hiding had left their mark, and now, confronted with reality, she wrestled with the consequences of her choices. Miss Marple knew, however, that healing was never instantaneous. It was a slow, deliberate process, demanding courage and self-reflection. "I've decided to leave, Miss Marple," Mrs. Bertram said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple looked at her, surprised. "Leave?" "Yes," Mrs. Bertram replied, her hands tightening in front of her.
"I've spoken to my son. He's agreed to take me in, away from the village.
I think it's time to step back from all of this, to try to find some peace, away from the reminders of what I've done and allowed to happen." Miss Marple studied her carefully, her eyes filled with quiet understanding. "Leaving may give you distance, Mrs. Bertram, but it will not free you from the past. You cannot outrun it, but by choosing to face it, you will discover the peace you seek." "I know," Mrs. Bertram whispered, voice trembling. "But it feels like the only way to move on. Perhaps one day, I'll return to the village. But for now, I need a place to sort through all of this." Miss Marple nodded gently. "I understand. Sometimes a change of scenery provides perspective. But remember, Mrs. Bertram, true peace comes from within. It's something we must create for ourselves." Mrs. Bertram's eyes glistened with unshed tears, yet she nodded firmly. "I'll try, Miss Marple. I really will." As they stood there, the village's quiet seemed to settle around them once more. Miss Marple knew Mrs. Bertram had made the right choice for herself. She needed time and space to reconcile her past, to find the strength to confront what had occurred and rebuild. Miss Marple could only hope that, in time, the widow would come to terms with the guilt that had weighed on her for so long. "Goodbye, Mrs. Bertram," Miss Marple said softly. "I wish you the very best on your journey. Remember, it is never too late to change, never too late to choose a different path." Mrs. Bertram offered a faint smile, the sadness still present but softened by a hint of gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Marple. You've helped me more than you." "No," Miss Marple interrupted gently. With one last glance, Mrs. Bertram turned and walked down the village lane, her pace steady yet thoughtful. Miss Marple watched her for a moment, then turned back to the quiet streets of St. Mary's. The village, like its people, would never be the same. Yet time, as always, would heal its wounds. The threads of the past would fade, and the villagers would learn to live with the choices they had made, the secrets they had kept. And when the next mystery arose, Miss Marple would be there, quietly observing, ready to uncover the truth. For now, St. Mary's rested in peace. The storm had passed, the village resuming its familiar rhythm. But Miss Marple knew that, as with all things, change was inevitable. More secrets would surface, more mysteries would demand resolution, and she would be ready, as always, to see the truth through. The end.